You're listening to Dateline Latin America, Tear Gas and Tango with
Joe Goldman, 37 years with ABC News, then with UPI, with The Village Voice, and many other.
And me, Daniel Schweimler, originally from London, formerly of the BBC, 19 years, and more recently with Al Jazeera English across Latin America.
They'll be sitting at a kitchen table in Buenos Aires talking about their journalistic adventures across the region, covering earthquakes, flooding and fires, talking to presidents, charlatans, sports stars and other newsmakers. In short, journalism and the state of the world.
Hey Joe, how are you doing? Another glorious day in Buenos Aires?
A wonderful day. The pool is open. Everything is hunky-dory.
Okay, I've just come up and seen in your garden, in your patio, and seen hummingbirds fluttering around there. So, which creates the impression that all is well with the world, doesn't it? I mean, hummingbirds on a hot day. Not the case in Bolivia.
No, Bolivia just had their election on Sunday. What you got to say is this possibility won. Wouldn't you say that, Daniel?
Well, I think just the fact they had free and fair elections with no violence. And it was a country that traditionally was almost a joke with the number of coups it had. I can't remember what the numbers were, but after the Second World War, up until the 80s, a ridiculous number of coups, coup attempts, short-lived presidencies. It just didn't work. And so this is something in the fact that Luis Arce from the left-wing mass has handed over power after 2 rounds of elections to Rodrigo Paz Pereira. I mean, it wasn't much of a choice, though, was it? A second round.
Quiroga got 45% of the vote. Jorge Quiroga, who had been president in 2001 for a short time, one of the many presidents, you were saying, Daniel, he seemed to be the Milei of Bolivia.
He was certainly pushing that, wasn't he? Better relations with the United States, basically sell the country for whatever they can get for it, clamp down on this, that and the other, anti-everything, a bit like Milei. Whereas Rodrigo Paz Pereira, of the right, but a little more moderate, talking about using Bolivia's vast natural resources for the benefit of the people rather than to make a few business people rich.
Yeah.
So he's a more interesting, a more nuanced character, let's say.
Yeah.
So perhaps not as severe as Tuto Quiroga might have been. But what's really interesting, I mean, they don't take power for another few weeks, but so Mas Luis Arce is still in power. But what on earth happened to Mas? In office since, I mean, I covered the elections. One of the first stories I did for the BBC back in December 2005 was Evo Morales winning those elections. First round of voting, a massively strong victory, first ever indigenous president of a country which has a majority indigenous population, so not one of these kind of white European elite. And they've been in power one way or other, mostly him, but then Luis Arce, ever since. And they were wiped out.
Yeah, completely. It's a lesson, really, for some of the center-left and leftist governments in South America, which they have produced powerful figures who, when a change is needed or constitutionally inherent, there are problems. Evo Morales had those problems. Correa in Ecuador had those problems. Certainly Argentina has had those problems too.
I mean, he was like a guy, he did a lot of good things when he came into office. I mean, he nationalized the oil and gas industry. I mean, there was Bolivia producing all this oil and gas, selling it to, the foreign investors, and very little was coming back into Bolivian hands. And when this was announced overnight, and all of a sudden there were these slightly confused state officials wandering around the offices of these now state-run buildings. And we flew up. They sent me straight up to La Paz when this happened, and there was nothing. There was no announcement. They'd just taken over. And I remember going into just one of these, walking in. There was no security. Walking into one of these buildings, trying to find somebody to talk to. And there was a guard outside. I think there was a guard outside who didn't stop me. And it was just the most bizarre. Like nobody really knew. They'd nationalized everything. But then the day after, nothing else really happens, People turn up for work and there was somebody using a photocopying machine. And so it was very odd. But it did put, certainly symbolically, these vast natural resources Bolivia has back in the hands of the state.
I believe it was YPFB. Yacimientos Petrolíficos petrolíferos fiscales bolivianos.
And we were talking a little bit before we came on air about how Bolivia has been shafted, to put it politely, by colonial powers since the first Europeans came.
Yes.
I mean, we were talking about Cerro Rico, this enormous mountain in Potosí, in the south of Bolivia. And I saw another article today, I've seen them many times over the years, that it's about to collapse, the mountain, because there's been so much mining, it's so riddled with holes that it can't sustain itself. But enough silver and other minerals were extracted, so it's probably slightly exaggerated, but to build a bridge from Potosí to its former colonial headquarters in Madrid. Unlikely, but it's a nice symbol of how much.
And it was the basis of Spanish power in the world for a long time.
Yeah.
In the 1600s, 1700s, Spain used that silver extraction to become a world power.
Yeah, I mean, Buenos Aires was a swampy backwater. None of the colonial, leaders at the time wanted to come here. That they wanted to go to
I think
Potosí.
Malays trying to make it that weekend.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, yeah. No, it was incredible. The art that was done there, everything was coated in silver and gold. It was quite something. You see remnants if you go to Potosí, but mostly it's a rundown, dusty city, for over 4,000 meters above sea level, with the widows and the orphans of the people who are still mining that Cerro Rico living on the mountainside because their breadwinner has died in the mountain, and they're just there waiting for handouts. It's the saddest
When
sight.
you see like average age that a miner lives till in some of those horrendous mines, it's just incredible. Of course, Bolivia has a new substance that they're looking for, which is lithium in the Uyuni deposit in
southwest. Yeah.
Bolivia. And that's also something that is going to be fought over.
Yeah. And Quiroga, if he'd have won, I think he would have sold that to the highest bidder. I'm sure Paz Pereira has no choice but to make sure foreign investors can get their hands on it. The question is how much, as always, Bolivia gets out of that. So, I mean, it is still one of the poorest countries in the region, has been since I can remember. But at the same time, I mean, I think what Evo Morales and Mas did for Bolivia, they empowered its huge indigenous population. I mean, there are many different groups. The two biggest are Quechua and Aymara, battling each other for dominance. Did incredible things, and I'm not sure if you did, but I certainly did. Everyone did the same story. The wrestling women, the cholitas, the indigenous women with the big skirts on, doing lucha libre wrestling on the outskirts of La Paz. I mean, symbolically, it looks great. I also went up the mountain with them. They took on mountaineering. They had gone up the mountain with their husbands, who were mountain guides. They'd been the cooks. And then they thought, well, why can't I do that? I can do this. I've got the capacity, the lung capacity to do it. And we went up with these women in their crampons, but everything else was indigenous, indigenous clothing, with a hard hat, of course, and an ice pick. And they were climbing these mountains at over 5,000 meters.
Like the Sherpas of South America.
Yeah. And pride in themselves as indigenous and as women, as female indigenous, and something they'd always been suppressed, doubly suppressed for being indigenous and for being women. And here they were exerting themselves in the ring and up the mountain in other ways as well.
One of the things that I found stunning, I hadn't been to Bolivia in about 15 years, maybe less, 12. And I went to cover the Pope Francis when he visited. And I was stunned at how La Paz had changed. They have a system of telefericos, cable cars, that is a bigger system than Buenos Aires subway system.
Wow.
And it's all new. It was done with Swiss technology. And it's amazing, and it's opened the city up totally. As one example, El Alto, is a suburb to the north with about 1.5 million people or something. It's near the airport, and you can now go to the airport by going up a cable car and then taking a short bus ride to the airport.
I mean, it can't be.
It was
I was
terrible.
going to say, it can't be any scarier than some of the taxis taking you from the airport
Oh,
down streets and up streets where you practically felt you were going to tip over backwards. Because again,
Yeah.
you're over 4,000 meters above sea level, and it can be. I mean, some people will turn up in La Paz, not necessarily very fit people, and be absolutely fine. Others, suffer greatly. I suffer for the first day always. It takes a while to acclimatize. We were talking about El Alto, and again, this kind of indigenous pride in their culture and background. We were talking about I think Frede Mumani,
Mamani,
the architect,
yeah.
who would build these enormous houses with kind of like indigenous symbolism in them. And they were very expensive, great attention to detail. They often had lifts, to the third, fourth, fifth floor. And they were like kind of spaceships or space stations. And it's very flat up on the top of the mountain in El Alto. And these things would stand out, these big tall buildings with these kind of red and blue frontages and the lifts going up and down and indigenous symbolism on the front. Very modern, but very also steeped in their kind of ancient culture. So kind of incredible. And
it was unbelievable. And part of that was there was an architectural tour of El Alto showing those incredible places. And I know there were imitations done around the world. It really took hold. All that culture, we talked a little bit about the food culture in our food show a couple of weeks ago. I'm wondering if this new government is going to ditch that past that Evo Morales was able to get into the indigenous culture and bring them up by the bootstraps in many ways.
Yeah, I think one of the issues was they talked about Bolivia's indigenous people, 60 or so percent of the population. But that's not enough. That's a general term for different indigenous groups, Aymara, Quechua, and many others. And some are conservative, and some are socialists, and some have some problems, and some have other problems. It's not, you can't, only in the early days could you talk about the indigenous community, because it is many things. It's not enough to talk about one word describing all these people, many people's needs and wants and desires, and that was partly the issue, And I think he didn't address the economic issue of the Quechua people or the ones living in the hillsides, in remote communities. He talked about defending the environment, big on the environment. Yet there were then say, I did a story once in the Tipnis National Park, beautiful untouched area with some indigenous people living there, some people farming it, and everyone talking about protecting it, saving it, and others saying we've got to build a road through the middle to get our produce out.
Remember that story.
And it was a long-running story. And Evo was on the side of the environmentalists, and then he said, "Well, the economy, we've got to get that road in there," and switched very quickly. And this indigenous support he had, certainly from the Tipnis area, just disappeared like that. He was seen as a traitor.
Now, what is going to be with the new government looking to have investments in things like mining, where you go, or really oil also in the eastern part of the country? What is going to be the situation of building roads, doing all kinds of infrastructure based on those investments? I don't know. We'll have to see what happens.
I think a lot will depend. Both Pereira and Quiroga talked about improving relations, re-establishing better relations with the United States and the Trump government, because Evo Morales never had any problems in his anti-American rhetoric and sometimes actions. He threw the Drug Enforcement Agency out, didn't he?
He actually threw the ambassador out of the country.
Yeah, for interfering, he said, in Bolivian politics, and specifically in Bolivian coca industry. The coca industry, coca leaves have been grown and harvested and chewed in Bolivia since anyone can remember. Okay, we know they're used in the production of cocaine, but most Bolivians will not use them in that way. And as we know, Evo Morales grew to dominance as a trade union leader in the coca leaf planters unions, very much involved in all of that. And he's now, after this defeat, or for months now, he's been hauled away in a hideout in the Chapare coca green region near to Cochabamba, surrounded by his supporters, accused of having sex with an underage girl. So statutory rape. which he denies, but the authorities want to prosecute him for that. And then they can't get to him. They couldn't get to him while his former ally, Luis Arce, was president. So I do wonder, as soon as the new guy, Paz Pereira, takes over, he's going to send the troops in and he's probably going to get Evo unless he can get out earlier. So imagine that. And then relations with the United States, which means probably investment, drug enforcement agency back, I guess. That's going to be an interesting one to watch.
I have to say that a good friend of mine, Michael Levine, who was the DEA agent in Buenos Aires in the late 70s and the early 80s, he then wrote some books after he left the agency. And I've talked extensively with Michael, and he talks about what it was like in the Bolivia of 1980, 1981, 1982, when they had the so-called cocaine coup. Garcia Mesa and Arce Gomez, the two military guys who took over and transformed the country into a cocaine launching pad, if you will. What Michael Levine talks about is how the CIA blocked the DEA from doing any kind of operations against those governments. And when Michael Levine sent one of his agents into La Paz, his agent was arrested and was tortured by the Bolivian military, not only by them, but by a strange old German man named Klaus Barbie, the ex-Nazi war criminal.
I mean, there's a record of Nazis. Okay, we always hear about Argentina and Brazil, but the east of Bolivia as well, especially in and around Santa Cruz. I mean, the economic powerhouse in a way of Bolivia with its oil and its gas, very much more European than the more indigenous west and north of the country. But they've been, several Croatian, Klaus Barbie and others have taken hold out there. And okay, they're long gone, but their sons, grandsons, and I say it's always the men, have been. There's also a breakaway movement, wasn't there, in the east of La Paz? They wanted to form their own independent homeland, the Kamba Nation. Very much like kind of Afrikaans in South Africa, the homestead, much more European, anti-indigenous. And I remember going there in 2007.
That was in which area?
This was around Santa Cruz, Santa Cruz in the east, yeah. But they were marching, I mean, massive persecution of the few indigenous people that lived in and around Santa Cruz. There was a trade body kind of ran the thing, and it was run by a guy called Branko Marinkovic, who was related,
Bolivian name.
really good Bolivian name, but related to an escaped Croat Nazi from the Second World War. And there was terrible things going on there at the time. They wanted to say a breakaway government, breakaway country, and Evo Morales' representative, she had to live in hiding in Santa Cruz. And I wanted to interview her, so I made contact with the local government, kind of almost a clandestine government, and they said, yeah, you can interview her, but not openly. And I did. It was like a thing from a poor spy movie. A truck pulled up by the roadside near my hotel. They blindfolded me, and then they took me to her hideout on the outskirts of Santa Cruz. And as we were approaching, somebody telephoned ahead to say what we're arriving. So we screeched around the hall, the garage door opened, we screeched into the garage, slammed on the brakes, they took the blindfold off, and I interviewed this young woman who said, look, I can't walk the streets openly because these, right-wing independence movement people wouldn't allow it to happen. I mean, Evo Morales later made peace, but there had been some killings. There had been, the poncho rojo, the indigenous people wearing their red ponchos, marching on La Paz. It was huge, huge issues. There was a massacre of indigenous people by its thought kind of right-wing homesteaders. So terrible things going on. Coup attempts involving foreign mercenaries. It was a country divided. I made the mistake then of saying, country on the brink of civil war. Journalists should never do that. Fatal, because obviously it didn't happen. But all the signs were there, 2007, 2008. And Evo Morales, to his credit, did manage to bring these warring sides kind of, to live in uneasy peace.
Won an election in Santa Cruz in about 2011, I believe it was. Something unheard of. But he really was able to galvanize the country. Then he ungalvanized it. But really, if you look at Bolivia, one of the things that to me was shocking For example, I had not been there for 12, 13 years. The exchange rate was exactly the same in
Yeah.
that time. I mean, that's very rare.
Coming from Argentina, especially where,
Absolutely.
yeah.
I mean, but you had that and you had almost no inflation.
Mm.
So the country was really economically run quite well.
Yeah, and a lot of people, especially indigenous community, don't participate in the standard economy. They're on the not black market, but they're the irregular economy.
Yeah.
They're out there in the mountains selling stuff. I remember changing money from Bolivian indigenous women with their many skirts, handing over the dollars, and they delve deep into the many skirts to find the money that's in there somewhere.
But I remember being in Bolivia in the 80s, and the exchange rate was $1 million.
Yeah.
I mean, it was absurd, the whole situation. So really controlling that was pretty amazing.
Yeah. And then he looked like the power kind of got to him, didn't he? He served his 2 terms in office. There was some kind of shenanigans with the constitution. He called a referendum to try and extend his time in office. He lost it, didn't accept, marginally, but he lost it anyway. Didn't accept the result. And kind of refused to leave, And then that's the thing. He built this big office in the lovely kind of main plaza in La Paz, where all the presidential buildings are, colonial buildings. And he built this big modern kind of office. I don't know how many stories, but glass fronted, high rise building, as a sign of what? His prestige, his power. So refusing to leave office, because only he could solve all of these problems, and then ended up in this ridiculous kind of right-wing coup, and ends up in exile. Went first to Mexico, and he turned up around the corner from where I used to live in Colegiales barrio in Buenos Aires, and he was about, I don't know, 50 meters away from my house. I never saw him. People just told me he was there. I knocked on his door a few times to ask if he wanted to be interviewed, and never got any message from him. But then marched back, didn't he? Got back Bolivia a year or so later, demanding that Luis Arce, his former mate, was now
kind of hand-picked successor at one point.
Yeah. And said, "I'm back now. Thanks a lot, but can you clear off?" And Arce, of course, said no. And then the two of them fell out. So,
what people say, political scientists in Bolivia, really of all stripes, will say is, my goodness, if Evo would have just stepped down, he would have left with a tremendous legacy.
Yeah.
And instead of that, power just got into his head, and he ruined that legacy. And there's another thing that happens that we can see in Argentina. It happened in Brazil during Dilma. There's a progression that's made when there's a progressive government, be it Lula, be it the Kirchners, be it there's a progression economically, be it Evo. That progression puts a lot of the lower class up into the middle class. Once they get there, there's an aspirational sense where they become very conservative, and they really smack the hand that fed them in many ways. They go really the other way. You see that all the time.
Well, the fact you're left with 2 right-wing candidates in the runoff elections. I mean, the first round of those elections, Mas ended up with 3% of the vote. They just about managed to sustain themselves as a viable political party. I think less than 3%, you're no longer a political party.
I think people were saying, we've had enough of this infighting.
Yeah.
We must move on. Let's move on to whoever.
Right. And 2 seats in Congress, none in the Senate.
2 seats after they had 75 seats.
I mean, that is a wipeout, isn't it? That is incredible. Wow. So, and I wonder, it's unlikely they're going to come back, because they're still infighting. Arce stood down. It was his candidate, his chosen guy who got the 3%. Evo's still there in his hideouts. So I don't see them coming back. Unless somebody else from Mas.
Garcia Linares.
His former vice president, kind of sensible, former left-wing revolutionary, I think served time in prison, but he was thought to be not say the brains behind Evo Morales, but certainly an ideological powerhouse behind Evo Morales. Do you remember when he first came to office? He used to wear these interesting sweaters knitted, I think, by his sister, and he used to go on to kind of summit meetings. Everyone else was in suits and ties, and he would wear his interesting looking kind of waistcoats and sweaters and things, and it became quite fashionable for a while. So he was out there. He would turn out, he would come out in the main plaza, he would talk to people. He was easy to get access to as a journalist in the early days. You could walk into that presidential palace, there was almost no security, knock on the door, is Evo in, sí, a la vuelta, es oficina de aquí, and you could almost not, but the longer he was there, the more and more distant he became. He stopped wearing the homely sweaters, but started building his towers, and I think, people just felt he was no longer one of them.
Beginning, his spokesperson was an American guy from Philadelphia.
Oh, really? Yeah. And the first time when he was inaugurated, early 2006, we went to, it was another inauguration. It was the inauguration of Michelle Bachelet in Chile, about the same time as he had come to power. And we went to Valparaiso to her inauguration. And then all the leaders, Latin American leaders, very much of the left at that time. It was Nestor Kirchner, Fidel Castro, Lula in Brazil, Correa in Ecuador, Pepe Mujica in Uruguay, all coming for this big meeting. They go about their separate ways, chauffeur-driven cars, and there's a bus for the press to take us back to Santiago. And Evo got on the bus. And which was just a lovely gesture, again shows he was then, and that's not something he would have done 2-3 years later, certainly not anymore. But it's always very nice when you see a leader, country leader, still in touch with the grassroots, which he was then.
It's going to be interesting because the changes that he made to the country were tremendous. A lot of wonderful changes. As I said, the infrastructure changes have just been unbelievable. The roads in Bolivia, always the stuff of horror movies, really changed.
But in the last couple of years, shortage of diesel, shortage of fuel, shortage of food. There's no dollars because I think the oil and the gas started to run out, didn't it? Or it was badly managed. It's hard to know. Yeah,
I think there's a lot of oil, and there's a tremendous amount of gas in the eastern part of the country.
Right.
But it's very hard to get to, and you have to build infrastructure, which means pipelines, which means roads, which means a whole bunch of things that have not got to that area.
Right. Well, let's hope. It's one of my favourite countries, Bolivia. I always love going there, despite the lack of oxygen in some places. But colourful, beautiful, great history, wonderful people. Yeah, so I would, would watch it with interest. You say the Americans probably coming back in a big way, but in the meantime, do you think they're going to invade? Your government's going to invade Venezuela in the next? They're amassing on the borders, aren't they? And in the sea, they've destroyed I don't know how many fishing vessels, which they say are drug cartel boats in the Pacific now as well as in the Caribbean. From the helicopter gunships, that do stealth raids, gathering as well. I wonder what Nicolas Maduro is doing right now. Is he quivering in his shoes, or is he making a run for it, or is he
I don't know.
Stacking up the sandbags.
The Venezuelan military, what is their reaction going to be in that situation?
Yeah.
What's Colombia's reaction going to be?
Should we keep an eye on that and see what happens?
And we need to keep an eye on a lot of things in Washington that are certainly having effects in Latin America these days.
Yeah, so Bolivia and Venezuela.
And Argentina.
Yeah, we've got our midterm elections on Sunday. The beginning of the end for Javier Milei, you think?
It does not look good. It does not look good for him, but he's been known to pull rabbits out of his hat.
And $40 billion IMF and US governments won't go amiss, I'm sure.
40 billion and a pledge of 20 billion more. Plus, the US Treasury is actually interfering in the exchange market here. They went in for $500 million in buying pesos. And a friend of mine who worked in the central bank here says that there's been a vault created which only holds pesos that the U.S. has won.
You couldn't make it up. Dip in the pool, I think, to cool off.
I would love it.